The first responsibility of the captain is safety of the passengers, the crew, and the aircraft. In accordance with Tokyo Convention of 1963, we need to make sure that in cases where we have unruly passengers aboard, we take all the necessary measures to avoid that any harm is done to other passengers, including, if necessary, restraining of the passengers. Pilots are never allowed to leave the cockpit in these cases, and the consequences may be quite negative if you're facing an unruly passenger. So it's the safety of the flight is the most important thing. You need to remain in the cockpit, and the cabin crew will be dealing with any issue in the cabin. Well, the first thing that the captain has to think about is to ensure that the passengers are safe. Talk to the cabin crews, communicate with them, make sure that they are handling the situation at their best, and eventually prepare for a diversion. It's a kind of funny story if I tell you now, but at the time was not so fun. In fact, many years ago, where we were still allowed to leave the cockpit and try to persuade the passengers to calm down when we were in this type of situation. I was a young co-pilot, and the captain left the cockpit telling me, I'll be back in a few minutes, and he said I can persuade the guy to calm down and we'll be landing in 20 minutes. So he went back, and he came back with a broken nose. So on top of having the passenger misbehaving on board, we also now have a situation of a pilot incapacitation when the captain was not able to perform his duties, and I had to take over as a young co-pilot and bring the airplane to land alone. There are very detailed company procedure to deal with this type of events on board. The first priority is to try not to escalate the situation, try to calm down the unruly passengers. Sometimes certain behaviors may be triggered just by the fear of flying, for example. These are the most manageable situation. If things get worse, the cabin crew know how to behave. They will stop serving alcohol, of course, to avoid intoxication of the passengers. They will try to calm the passenger down, eventually move other passengers from the area where the unruly passenger is seated. And in the worst case scenario, the captain may decide to divert in order for local authorities to intervene and take that person into custody. Well, in accordance with the Tokyo Convention, there is a limit to what authorities on the ground may do. Normally, police forces are very cooperative, but there may be cases where they won't be able to intervene because the nationality of the aircraft won't allow them legally to take on charge of the person that has misbehaved in flight. That's why we, as pilots, very much support the Montreal Protocol of 2014 that would give local authorities the power to take custody of unruly passengers regardless of the nationality of the aircraft and the state where the flight has landed following an unruly passenger's incident. Teamwork is fundamental. The pilots are locked into the cockpit. They won't be going out of the cockpit. They rely on the cabin crew. So the cabin crew are our eyes and our ears. I would say that it's not only the cabin crews. Ground personnel, for example, have a big role to play in this. Imagine that some of these passengers may already be unruly on the ground. And the ground personnel needs to be aware that if they see an intoxicated passenger, a passenger who's already problematic on the ground, they should inform the flight crew so that we can take actions before we actually go in the air. Solving a problem in the ground is much easier than solving a problem once you are flying. The cabin crew have all the support of the captains, the first officers. We talk to them. We will make sure that we will land if there is a need to land as soon as possible, and we will make sure that authorities will intervene to take charge of unruly passengers in the worst case scenarios. I just say relax, enjoy your flight. The crews are perfectly trained to take care of this type of issues, these incidents, and they are not so common, but we also need the cooperation of everybody on board. So if you as a passengers are flying and start noticing something strange in the person sitting next to you, approach a cabin crew and in a confidential way maybe let him or her know that there's something wrong with some of your fellow passengers, and the crew will know what measure to put in place to try to de-escalate the situation. I've seen both physical and psychological consequences. I had a case many years ago when pilots were still allowed to leave the cockpit, in those cases where my colleague came back to the cockpit with a broken nose, which was not nice experience, of course, but I've also seen cabin crews being very much affected and meeting them after months from an event that we had together, and they were still affected psychologically by what had happened on board. I would say that in 25 years of flying with the airlines, I probably have experienced 4 or 5 serious cases of unruly passengers on board, from passengers smoking in the toilet, to passengers being intoxicated, to passengers assaulting cabin crews.